Today I will be making the case that the tankers that were attacked right here on the exit of the Strait of Hormuz on the 13th of June 2019, the tankers Front Altair and Kokuka Courageous are the ones in question, were not attacked by Iran. Now, my reasons for saying that are this. One, an attack by a surface vessel using limpet mines on a target so massive as a oil tanker so blatantly at pretty much the first point where you're actually in international waters is incredibly suspect and incredibly ineffective, almost to the point where one would say you can't take it seriously. One, because there was no ecological disaster, and two, because there were no casualties. Also, there wasn't much of an economic hit. So, what was the purpose? Also, what was the purpose if Iran is the perpetrator, and why would they do it when in talks with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? The answer is they wouldn't. The form of attack, the style of attack, is not out of Iran's playbook. It is not one of their expected or projected means of closing the strait or cutting oil prices or cutting oil traffic or anything along those lines. In fact, there's no real reason that Iran would have done that at all. If Iran was planning to shut down the strait, they would have done so right here. One of their major naval ports here is Bandar Abbas. Bam. Now, most of their major naval vessels, which can be found on Google Earth, are housed there. So if one wanted to close the strait, one could do so by using one's surface navy. Bam, closing the strait. They could do so by laying mines across the strait, which at its widest point, I believe, is only about 40 miles, probably a little bit less. Or they could do so using their submarine fleet. Now, the submarine fleet has been talked about in recent years, has since been forgotten. But they're small. They are small, a few men. It's not large submarines that are really designed to only take one shot. They're designed to shut down shipping traffic or make shipping traffic so unsafe and risky that it shouldn't be risked in very, very small areas. Now, these submarines are not Hunt for Red October types of submarines. They're small, designed to take out civilian tanker traffic, right? So, if Iran was going to close down the strait, they would have done so by either mining the strait, closing down the strait with their surface navy, which would be an actual blockade, or simply attacking shipping traffic with their submarine fleet, which is rather expansive. If you get the chance, I would take a look on Google Earth and take a look at how many submarines they've got sitting in Bandar Abbas. So, this is not Iran's playbook. They were in talks with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and the reason that's important is that Japan makes up about 5.4% of Iranian total trade. Now, that's a pretty significant number. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it is a pretty significant number, especially when you're talking about a developed nation like Japan in trade with a country that the U.S. seems to hate so much, like Iran. That's a really big deal. So when Iran is talking with the Japanese Prime Minister, that would be a very, very bad time to then attack a Japanese ship. Why would that be done? Why would Iran threaten 5.4% of its global trade? Answer is they wouldn't. Also true is that about 60% of Iran's total exports are oil exports. Now, any oil export by sea would immediately be halted by the United States and its associated powers through blockades, attacks, all sorts of or seizures, privateering, this kind of thing is not unknown. So this coast would pretty much be locked down. There would be no, especially oil trade coming through here. There may be smuggling efforts, but you're not going to smuggle a large tanker through a blockade. While you could do so with a small speedboat, you could not do so with a massive tanker whose top speed is about 10 knots. A knot is a nautical mile an hour, by the way, for those who don't know. So Iran would put themselves in a very, very bad position if they chose to close the straits. So my statement is Iran did not choose to close the straits, or even make it seem as though they were trying to close the straits. In fact, it seems that they've been very, very adamant in stating that they're not trying to close the straits. So, probably the most relevant other actor in the area for Americans is the United States. Now, would the United States be affected by a closure in the Strait of Hormuz? Well, the answer is not really. The United States imports about 7.969 million barrels of crude oil a day, then turns around, refines that, and exports about 5.218 million barrels a day, and more than likely consumes the rest. Also true, the United States has recently become a net exporter of even crude oil due to the absolute economic miracle of fracking that has allowed access to oil fields in Texas, in California, in Alaska, that were previously inaccessible. So, the United States, from a national security perspective, is actually not affected by what's going on here in the Straits. The risk that the United States faces is simply that it will not have kept its word to its European allies by keeping the strait open. So basically, the only risk that the United States takes here is a little bit of egg on their face. So, really, is it worth going to war? Likely not from the United States perspective. Also, oil prices should not be affected because we don't get much oil, if any, through here. So, we'll move on then from the United States to the next actor that Americans will and have brought up, and that is go all the way over here to Israel. Right? Now, Israel, of course, does benefit from an Iran who is not quite so strong. That being said, in this particular instance, it's not just Iran who's the problem. So, Israel, as far as oil goes, is pretty much in the same position as the United States because it relies on refined oil from the United States. So long as the United States is able to keep refined oil flowing to Israel, Israel cares very little for what happens to oil trafficking. Also true is Israel just discovered, or not just, but within the past few years, discovered two of the largest oil finds in recent decades. Those are the Leviathan and Tamar oil fields. Now, they're having some technical problems getting some of that oil out, but they are actually producing oil, and then sending it to the states to be processed. That said, too, their energy grid is not affected by oil or gas prices because they're 95% powered by in-house coal. So Israel is actually in a pretty good place, well, as far as oil is concerned, and they would not be affected by closing of the straits, which leaves one last major actor, that being Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is in fact the oil kingdom of the world. Their oil profits make up about 42% of their GDP, and ensuring that those oil revenues keep coming in makes up about 87% of their state budget. So oil is a very, very big deal in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia has one very distinct advantage. If you'll notice, any of the other countries here, other than Iran, Iran does have a border here, but any of the other countries, the majority of the UAE, Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, which is another oil-producing nation, all of these nations don't have a border with a sea that's not the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia does. They have the Red Sea. Now, why is this important? Well, because Saudi Arabia has a pipeline called the East-West Pipeline that starts here in this city called Dammam. It was originally designed to take Bahraini oil to the Red Sea, all the way across to Yanbu. Now, because it was designed for Bahraini oil, and Bahrain is a very small nation, it was only really capable of handling about 1.8 million barrels of oil a day. That was later expanded to about 3 million barrels a day, a little more than that. In recent years, it was expanded again to about 5 million barrels a day, though that capacity is actually a bit too much for what Saudi Arabia is capable of handling, or capable of shipping across. Now, Saudi Arabia does in fact ship out through the Gulf of Oman as well, and through the Strait of Hormuz. It does ship oil out that way, and it ships out from this side. So 5 million barrels of oil a day on this pipeline shipping between Dammam and Yanbu is, well, more than sufficient for the amount of oil that needs to be traded across the coasts. So Saudi crude exports amount to about 7.341 million barrels a day total. Now, remember, a lot of that is being shipped directly to the seaports and being put directly on a tanker, so that it's not all passing through this pipeline, which means that 5 million barrels a day from Dammam to Yanbu is actually far more than sufficient for Saudi Arabia's oil production and export. So what that would usually indicate is if you are over capacity, you would stop investing in expansion because you aren't actually able to produce enough to use the infrastructure that you are creating. Saudi Arabia did not do that. They chose to reinvest. And now, with a project completion date in 2018, which is very, very convenient timing, by the way, the East-West Pipeline is able to handle almost 7 million barrels a day. So that is almost their entire crude export numbers as of 2017. And it hasn't been kicked up that much since then. So what that means is that while they were already over capacity on this pipeline, they are now very over capacity on this pipeline. There's a little bit of oil from these nations in here that's shipped across to the Red Sea, but not all that much, because it's actually more expensive to ship it across land through a pipeline than it is to put it on a tanker and ship it across the sea. Moving heavy things is hard, and moving heavy things on water is easier. So generally, shipping oil is cheaper than shipping it across the pipeline. So we've already explained how the pipeline works here. If Saudi Arabia can manage to lever the idea that Iran is such a threat to shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, then the Strait of Hormuz is in fact effectively closed. Nobody's going to put however many millions of dollars worth of potential revenue that they have invested in each of these tankers through someplace so unsafe as the Strait of Hormuz, especially in a potential wartime environment. Right? They're not going to send their money through a war zone. So this means that whether Iran actually closes the strait or not, the straits will be closed. The flow of oil traffic will not exist as far as that goes. So the straits don't actually even need to be closed. Now, once the straits are effectively closed, either in a real or imaginary fashion, most of the UAE oil, Qatari oil, Bahraini oil, Kuwaiti oil, and Iraqi oil will all have to come through Dammam if they plan to make any money on it at all. Which means that Saudi Arabia has levered itself into being the exclusive exporter of oil from the Middle East. They control everything. Now, in doing this, in creating this monopoly, they will also, given that they have a restricted infrastructure, only 7 million barrels of oil a day, which is not nearly as much oil as is being shipped through the Strait of Hormuz right now. They will artificially restrict the supply of oil coming through. Blame it on infrastructure problems, of course. And therefore jack up the price. If the demand stays the same and the supply is diminished, and the demand is probably going to go up while the supply is diminished, the price is going to go up as well. And it's going to go up in no small fashion. So, Saudi Arabia is set to make bank on this deal. Saudi Arabia has been clearing the Red Sea up and down. Really, the only issue, they didn't have any issues going up through the Suez Canal, which is a very, very small. It's a very, very small channel and is not likely to be mined or bombed or attacked, given that there are two semi-friendly nations straddling it. You have Saudi Arabia on one side and you have Egypt on the other side, and they're not likely to attack each other over the Suez Canal at the moment. To the south, you have Sudan. Sudan doesn't have much of a navy, and nor does it really care much about what Saudi Arabia is doing. Eritrea, well, that's the same story. Most people don't even know Eritrea is a country, and there's a reason for that. Now, down here, the only problem that the Saudis may have is Yemen. So, the Saudis have been clearing up and down the Yemeni coast, in their proxy war with the Houthis, basically eliminating any possibility of a threat from the Yemeni coast. And to help them with that, you have both U.S. and Chinese influence down here in Djibouti. They're both there with the stated mission of keeping piracy down. So any bad actors from Eritrea, Sudan, or Yemen would likely be handled very easily by the Americans and the Chinese, which means that the Saudi Navy only really has to handle the Houthi presence and its own borders or its own coastline, which again is not really in threat, or is not really under threat anywhere other than right here. And right here, you have both a major American naval base and a major Chinese naval base. So you're not likely to see much in the way of conflict from the Yemenis, which means that there's a relatively safe path of travel for oil both north and south of the Red Sea. All right, which makes Saudi Arabia the safest bet for anyone looking to get oil out of the Persian Gulf. So, game is this. Saudi Arabia levers to get the Strait of Hormuz closed. Strait of Hormuz closes. Saudi Arabia now has a monopoly on oil trade in the region. Saudi Arabia has made the United States foot the bill by going to war with Iran, or at least levering against Iran by pushing more American naval forces into the area, and thereby footing the bill for the defense, for Saudi Arabia's defense, and doing the same with piracy concerns over here in the Red Sea. So the United States is actually pretty much completely handling and protecting Saudi Arabia's monopoly position, and it will be for, well, the foreseeable future, which means Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq all are reliant on Saudi Arabian oil transport. This is the scam. And this is my reasoning for believing that Saudi Arabia, being the only actor in the vicinity that actually stands to benefit from any sort of war or conflict with Iran, is in fact the perpetrator of these attacks. Now, we can add to this that the crewmen of the Japanese vessel have made the claim publicly that they were not attacked by limpet mines. They were instead attacked from the air twice. It was a sustained attack that lasted over the course of, I believe, 3 hours, but don't quote me on that. I would check yourself. So there was at least one shot fired that was not effective, that was avoided by the crew, and then there was another shot that followed that up that did in fact impact the vessel, which means that that target was not a target of opportunity. It was in fact picked. It was chosen. So you have two tankers that were chosen targets in international waters, which is probably the only place that this could happen. You know, if it were in Irani waters, the only people who honestly could have done it would likely be Iran. But it didn't happen in Irani waters. It happened in international waters, which means that anybody with access to these waters, Saudi Arabia is an actor with access to those waters, could very easily have attacked these vessels by drone. Now, this is further strengthened by the claim that the Iranians had attacked a U.S. drone. However, the U.S. has not actually made a claim as to whether or not the U.S. drone was attacked. Now, one can conject, as it were, one can, what's the word? Well, I'll just go with conject. One could say that it is possible that one of the only other actors that has access to such advanced American technology as a drone is Saudi Arabia. So the United States has access to this stuff, Saudi Arabia has access to this stuff, and most of the other countries only have access to this stuff through the United States or Saudi Arabia, which means that they don't actually have this equipment themselves. Saudi Arabia does. There have been weapons sales to Saudi Arabia that make the news nearly every 6 months. It happens all the time. We sell them lots and lots and lots of weapons. This means jets, drones, guns, bombs, all sorts of stuff goes to Saudi Arabia that is American. So the idea that the Iranians actually did fire on an American drone is not so far out of the realm of reality, especially if that particular American drone was controlled and owned by Saudi Arabia and not the United States. If it was owned by the United States, it's far more likely that there would have been a press release claiming that that was an American drone in international waters performing international duties in accordance with international law, something along those lines. There would have been a stock statement released, and there hasn't been, which means to me that it was not an American drone. It was likely a Saudi drone. And that Saudi drone could very easily have made those strikes in international waters without tipping anybody off, using a very light payload that was designed not to cause economic damage or human damage. If it was designed to actually take down a tanker or actually kill people, it would have been a much heavier charge, and there would have been a much, much greater ecological disaster, which didn't happen, which means to me that this attack was in fact not intended to take these tankers down. It wasn't intended to do anything other than make the statement that this area is unsafe. Don't ship your oil through the Strait of Hormuz. It's bad. Iran is bad. Right? Iran is bad. Or so we're told. But this is it. This is who it is. Saudi Arabia is the only actor in the area that stands to gain. I said it before, I'll say it again. One actor stands to gain, and that is Saudi Arabia. No one else stands to gain. Only Saudi Arabia. Think about that. So that kind of closes the presentation. I want to make it very clear. The purpose of this is to hopefully inform you about what's actually happening in the Gulf and who is actually the bad guy here. Iran is not the bad guy. There may be bad things that happen in Iran, but in this particular instance, Iran is not at fault, and war is not justified. Not justified. I'll say it again. So please do what you can. Call your congressman, share this video, do something to help. And most important of all, don't get drawn into this warmongering crap. It's not real. It's a lie. Iran is not a threat to the United States. We do not need and we do not want war with Iran. We do not want, I do not, I as a person who may in fact be called up, do not want to go to war with Iran for Saudi Arabia. Not with Saudi Arabia, okay? Not because of something Saudi Arabia has done. This is going to war at the direction and for the exclusive benefit of Saudi Arabia. This is not for the American people. This is not for liberation of Iran. This is not for the safety of shipping traffic. Okay? This is for Saudi Arabia. It will do nothing but hurt the United States, hurt the surrounding nations, and it will just contribute to the ever ongoing war in the Middle East, which has been happening for, 18 years now? Do we have the stomach for another one? Can we add another country to the list? Are we not tired of bombing people for lies? Okay, in Iraq, it was WMDs. No? Guess what was never found? WMDs. In Afghanistan, I'm not even going to go into it. I'm not going to go into any 9/11 stuff. It's a lie. You know it's a lie. I know it's a lie. Anybody who's paying attention to this knows it's a lie. There's not enough information to call it Iran, and yet we're still levering, sending troops to prepare for this invasion of Iran, or at least the suppression of Iran. I want you to call your congressman, call your representatives, call whoever it is you know, call your grandma. Spread this information and let it be known that we do not want war. Thank you.